Hi, welcome. I'm here with Rob Cross. We're here in Atlanta at the City Winery. We're going to do an event this evening. You're going to talk about the Microstress Effect with a group here in the Atlanta area. Rob, thanks for sharing time and congratulations on getting this over the finish line.
Oh, thank you so much, and absolutely great to be here. It's quite a place you picked out.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, isn't it? And yeah, we'll have some photos and videos of it later. But for now, let's focus on the book, because when you introduced it to me a few months ago, I was like, hell yeah.
I need more people like you.
Yeah.
A lot more.
I mean, because we have all these micro stressors happening in life, and you're calling it out, and obviously it affects our well-being. So from your standpoint, what led to the research that ultimately led to the book?
Yeah, great question. So I had been doing a lot of work with my consortia, the Commons, for some time, looking at high performers. And I was lucky enough that the companies really pushed me to think about not just performance and how people are collaborating that are generating performance, but about 5 or 6 years ago, they were asking about well-being, and can we also understand people that are just thriving in their work, career satisfied, psychological well-being, things like that. So it was super lucky, because they got me focused on well-being 5 or 6 years back when it wasn't as trendy as it is right now, coming through COVID and everything. And it allowed me to get a really good running start. We did, about 600 interviews in aggregate for this book and other pieces off of it to really understand not well-being in aggregate, but really how do relationships play a role in our day-to-day experience of well-being and happiness today, and be able to do some things on that.
Well, how do they play a role? Because I have my own frame of reference. I know we all do, particularly given what happened in COVID. I mean, we rely on other people, yet we also were getting pelted from different channels, platforms on, oh gosh, I want this, I need to be responsive, and that created stress, at least in my life. So, again, tell me, what are some of the salient ideas that came out of this?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And for me, the interesting thing that I got really motivated on the work is around this notion that so many bodies of work are showing that connections have a very big impact, on our physical well-being. We know the loneliness work shows that lack of connections that are important to you is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day in terms of mortality rate. If you're lonely, 26% greater mortality rate in certain intervals of time. And so you go down the list of the lack of connections in people's lives that have happened despite being hyper-connected. It's the authenticity, the intimacy, things like that have gotten lost a lot of times in the connections. And the physical effects of that alone, and you wonder why we're not paying more attention to it. We'll chase cholesterol drugs, we'll look at blood pressure medicines, but we're not doing things to make sure that the quality of the connections that we seem to need in our lives are there. I think probably the biggest aha for me, though, is most of those books and the work is really saying you need close relationships in your life. And the reality is most of us sustain probably 5 relationships at that level. Maybe a few more, maybe a few less. Some people have 0. But what we need from others is growing in a way that's really helped me hone in not just on the high quality connections, but the interactions that are happening within those connections. And if you look at it that way, and you think about the relationships as kind of pipes that things flow through, you see that there's both negative aspects to some relationships and positive, and you can actually fine tune them in different ways that has a pretty neat effect.
And are you talking about personal relationships or professional relationships, or both? Just relationships in general?
Yeah, for me it's both.
Okay.
So when we went through the interviews, we were initially asking people, tell me about ways that connections in your life, whether they're professional or personal, have an impact on your physical health, the way you're growing in and out of work, your purpose, like how you have a sense of purpose in your life, and the degree to which you're resilient, right? And so resilience is an example of, most people think of resilience as something we own, right? It's internal fortitude or grit, or, we're resilient. But if you ask 600 people to tell you about setbacks in their lives, right? And they range from, I didn't get the promotion, to my spouse died of pancreatic cancer, you know what I mean? And a whole suite of things. And then not say, well, what did you do to get through, but ask them, how did you fall back on others? You get really 8 predictable ways that we rely on others in going through difficult stretches, that the people that have those relationships and know how to use them, they go through much better. Right? And so that can come from work, it can come from home, it can come from close confidence, distant confidence. And that's really a part of what I really want to emphasize in this work, is thinking again about the interactions you need in your life, and not just 5 close relationships, because it can come from different places.
I am so excited to get into the book. I mean, full disclosure, I just got my hands on this about an hour ago, and because this
Me too. I've only seen one.
Yeah, this isn't publicly distributed yet, so I have some homework to do. But there's so many questions that I want to ask, and I'll be disciplined here, because as you were sharing that, I thought about Sean Akers' work, The Happiness Advantage, and the number one attribute of happy and successful people in his research was the quality of their support system. And what I have found anecdotally is that it's not only the quality of your support system, in my view, it's your willingness, ability to access that support system.
Right.
It's not just because it's there. You have to be vulnerable. You have to go through. You have to make those connections and be conscious about it. Is that a fair statement? And how does that relate to the research?
I think it's incredibly true. You know, and I think unfortunately people don't invest in connections a lot of times that create that. Number one, and number two, I actually think we're not good at sometimes knowing what we need. From others. So some people are very much empathy people, but you can get mired in empathy if you're also not getting, here's a path forward, here's how you get out of it, and either kind of a cognitive, way out or motivation to get out. For me, I'm a laughter person. You know what I mean? It's not so much empathy, but I need somebody to just help me just laugh at the absurdity of the situation. And everybody was different, as I went through it. They needed kind of different constellations of things. And again, those things didn't just come from a best friend. Right? They actually came from different places for the people that actually weathered different storms well in different ways.
Yeah, if I'm listening to us and I'm familiar with Brene Brown, I'm thinking the power of vulnerability. If I'm going to have authentic connections, then I'm going to have to open up. How does that relate into, again, what you're finding here with the microstress effect?
I think from the interviews that we did here, you start to see the people that are more vulnerable, they create trust, more rapidly. Number one, we know that's an important precursor. But they actually start to create the conditions where connections are feeding back to them, in different ways. And so I think it's a big deal, right? And obviously it can't be too much in the sense of either disclosure or just woe is me, too much on that level, because it tends to distance people. But just enough tends to create the conditions that feeds back to you, in different ways.
And that takes, correct me if I'm wrong, practice. Many people just don't show up that way. They have to practice being vulnerable, and similarly they have to practice setting boundaries. So when you first explained the book, in essence, to me, I was thinking about just that, boundary setting, and what too many relationships, where you can't really show up for people, it becomes overly transactional, and it might actually diminish well-being. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think if I go back to that pipe metaphor, that the relationships are a conduit, right, of some things, then what we're also finding is that the relationships that are most positive in our lives, our children, our parents, our friends, people we care about and love, are incredible sources of microstress too. And that if we're not thinking about how do we preserve that relationship, but kind of fine tune it a little bit in ways that remove the microstress, then you're kind of leaving the highest leverage stuff on the table. I mean, we know historically that the negative dimensions in relationships account for about 3 to 5 times the impact of the positive. Right? And so if all we're doing is things that lean into the positive connections, or mindfulness or meditation, or things that help us persist through the negatives, and we're not adapting them, we're actually leaving really high leverage potential on the table, right, for improving our well-being. So I'll give you an example. I have a daughter, just very similar age as yours, that was a high-end tennis player, in the U.S. And so we traveled the country. I knew nothing about tennis, right? My only job was to try and keep her, on the right path in different ways. And she got very used to coming to me anytime anything went wrong, in these tournaments, and then setting up practice schedules and everything else. That dynamic persisted into her adulthood without us really thinking about it. It's just a pattern that we were in. But what would happen is, as Rachel kind of went through college, and then she started applying to medical school and other things like that, every setback that happened would be a short text to me. Right, and it was just a knee-jerk reaction. Right, half the time she didn't care; she was over it in 10 seconds. but I would worry about it for 3 or 4 hours. And we didn't uncover that until over a glass of wine one night. And I was said, Rachel, cut it out. You're killing me.
Right.
You know, and so that's a little bit of what I mean, because that's very easy to fix. She said, oh my gosh, well, if it doesn't matter to me, I'm not going to pass it on, right, to Dad in this case. Doesn't change the relationship. She knows when something's important. I'm there in a heartbeat. But it takes the stress that was accrued in that interaction down for me in a big way. We have countless opportunities to kind of shift things like that if we start looking at, you know, where and how the microstress is coming from.
So just to play that back, so she's more mindful of how she reaches out to you and asks for help. Is that a fair statement?
Right. Or just vents and lets
Yeah.
me know, you know, and when it's not important, she doesn't pass it on. And that's one of the 14 microstresses. You know, we see secondhand stress that gets propagated through these networks. The way that I look at them is really significant. You know, it can be as simple as how the posture you take, right, in a meeting, or the tone of voice, or actual venting behaviors, or things like that, that kind of moves through groups. And so,
you know, as you're sharing this, I recall Don Klinghoffer of Microsoft sharing a research they did around Friday afternoon emails, and how that unconsciously sent people into, you know, haywire. You know, all of a sudden they're preparing for the weekend and they get, you know, a very casual email with a request, and all of a sudden, you know, they're staying late or working over the weekend, and obviously building up stress. And so my pointed question coming out of that, who's this book for? Is it for organizational leaders? Is it for individuals? Is it for team leads? Is it all the above?
I think right now it's geared towards the individual, right? And saying, how do you make adaptations to the way you're interacting with others that can yield a happier existence? You know, I mean, the reality of it for me is we have more control over what we do and who we do it with today than ever in history. You know, we don't rely on the weather to eat hardly anymore. I mean, things are pretty good, yet we're miserable. You know, the burnout's at an epic, you know, levels. And I'm very convinced that a lot of it, you know, 50% or more, is not that the work has shot up, it's the collaborative footprint around the work, all the modalities that these small stresses get to us in different ways. And it's bigger than just conventional stress. You know, it's bigger than just bad news on TV. Because if I like you, you know, like with Rachel, when something like that came at me, I worried about it quite a bit. You know, it spiked me bigger. If I dislike you, same thing, right? And I may actually not only experience it personally, but I may go home and complain about it to my significant other and relive the experience again. You know what I mean? And so that was one of the more interesting things too, is these all seem like small moments, things that we should fight through as successful people. But what happens is they don't register the fight or flight response in the brain, but the body's absorbing it. And so our blood pressure goes up, our heart rates go up. There's some evidence that if we're under this form of stress, eating the same meal is like 204 calories more than metabolically than if we're not under the stress, which adds up to like 11 pounds a year, the scientists were saying. So, you know, that's a really big deal to kind of be thinking about how what seemingly are small moments like that email actually lead to bigger, and they actually can then cascade forward. Because I'm sure that Don's example wasn't just the email to one person, it was the way it cascaded out again.
Sure.
In different ways.
Well, so you and your co-author, Karen Dillon, it's 14?
14. Yep.
14? How did those emerge? I mean, how did you sift through all the possibilities there?
Yeah, it was literally the first interview of what ultimately was 600. And again, I was focused because of the consortia pushing me, saying we want to understand how relationships affect well-being. Well, just like everybody else, I was focused on the positive, right? What do we need to build into our life? Like all the books recently that have come out that says we need friends or we need things like that. So I'm in my first interview, and it was a life science executive in London, lovely British accent. I won't try to emulate, you know, here. and I just said, you know, tell me about a time in your life you're becoming more physically healthy, whatever that means to you, and not what you were doing, but what was the role of relationships, right, around you. And she started off just kind of chuckling, and she said, Rob, I was the person that dodged gym in high school at every chance I could, right? I wanted nothing to do with physical activity. And she said that worked for me up until kind of mid-30s, late 30s, where my health was declining, you know, at a pretty big rate. And that's actually very common, right? What we find is that people fall out of the groups that are keeping them healthy, typically late 30s, early 40s, because of the professional and personal, you know, obligations that peak. And she said what I started to do was walk around this park outside of my flat in London, right? And so it was just a simple stroll at first, and then she happened to bump into same people doing it every day, and then they started walking a little further together, and the walk moved to a charity walk and then a short run, and you get where my story's going.
Yeah.
Where 10 years later, when I was interviewing her, she would go on vacations with her husband where they were running a marathon first before doing the vacation itself, and this was the person that dodged gym, right, in high school. And so it was this amazing interview, because she was saying it's the activity that's helping me push back on work, the identity of being a runner, but really critically, it's the relationships that I'm in that are a part of it with me. They're coming from diverse perspectives. They see me at my worst. I see them at their worst. We share perspectives on life that really helps us rise above the minutia, in different ways. So this is like a 100-mile-an-hour interview, and the first one of 600, I'm like, this is going to be awesome, And I stopped about halfway through and I said, well, what got you in trouble to begin with? And this interview that was going along like crazy, everybody laughing, went down to 0, and she just looked at me for a second, and obviously brilliant woman, and she said, I don't really know. And she said, just life, I guess. And it kind of really led me to lean into that, to say, well, what does that mean, right? What is the accumulation of small moments that traps us, day to day, week to week? And then most people, as we went through these 600 interviews, had 3, 5, 8-year stretches of their life where they were really crushing hard, and they woke up one day and said, I am not who I meant to be, right? Everybody had, windows like that. And it wasn't the big things, it wasn't the massive health scares or getting laid off. It was the accumulation of small.
Yeah.
And so it started in that interview, but it just became not what I was looking for, to be honest. And it became something that was very prevalent. And as I said before, we don't do enough of thinking about how do we shift the negatives. You know what I mean? We focus too quickly on how do we get a best friend or how do we get purpose in our lives. Whereas there's a lot of impact, for me just adapting that interaction with my daughter, right? That takes a lot of stress out of my life in a very easy way.
Wow, guys, thank you for sharing, because I'm actually learning as we go, and I reflect on my own experience with my family and me personally. And I read recently that trauma often is defined by ourselves and by therapists and psychologists as being one big event, yet it's also a series of cumulative events. And that's what I hear you saying. And if we can be conscious about these events, then we can mitigate the risk, maybe stop some things from happening. And where I'll wrap this up in a question, recently I heard from Andrew Huberman, neurobiologist at Stanford, and I'm sure talked about action before mindset. And I was really taken aback by that, because I had been like, all right, get in the frame of mind and then go. And you're trying to willpower through it. And what I hear with that example with Karen is that, okay, go out and do stuff, and that's going to put you in a better place to go and prioritize and set boundaries and all these other things. Is that, did you find some insights that shed light towards that end as well?
Yeah, and I'll answer it a little bit more broadly, but I'll come back to that, because I think that's actually the most important of the 3 levers. But what we talk about in the chapter 5 here is we really have a way of looking at the 14 microstresses. So it's a table that it lists the 14 microstresses, and then across the top are where they're coming from. Is it boss, colleagues, clients, loved ones, people in your lives. So in aggregate, right, professional.
We're going to go through those today.
We are, exactly.
Right.
You've seen this table.
Yeah, exactly.
But I have people go through it, in groups, and I'll have them do it in 3 passes. The first pass is, put an X in the cells where there's a microstress that's systemic enough that you should do something about it, right? So the interaction with Rachel and I, my daughter and I, systemic enough that if I could remove that or adapt it, it had a big impact for me. And I'll ask people to put, 3 or 4 marks in there, and many people will say, gosh, there's at least 10 I could put. And I'm like, no, because if it's everything, it's nothing, right? You got to hone in on 2 or 3, and they'll have a material impact on you. And again, that's a big deal, right? Because negative is 3 to 5 times the impact of the positive. Right? So if you can shift a small set of negatives, it has a disproportionate impact. Second pass I have them go through is say, now which ones of these are you causing others? And that always shocks people. In big audiences, I may even poll, and what I'll find is the the microstresses that we're experiencing are almost always identical to the profile we're passing on to others. And so what you're trying to think about is, how do I stop this, in part because of who you want to be. But I think the bigger aha for me as we went through all these interviews is the stress we create inevitably boomerangs back on us in a different form, right? So we lean on our child too hard for grades and there's a belligerence that comes out, or lean on an employee too hard and there's less engagement that comes in. And so the more you can go through and be mindful about not creating it in those different interactions, then that's going to take it down, as well. And then I think the third, to me, and perhaps the most important, is going back through and saying, where do you have 3 or 4 areas that you're just down too far in the weeds? You know what I mean? And you've allowed the minutia to take over. And what I can see with what I call my 10 percenters, the people that just manage to really be living differently through all these interviews and kind of thriving in a really unique way, is they tend to have typically at least 3 groups they're an authentic part of outside of their profession, and it can come from any and all walks of life. But one of my favorite interviews was a very, very prominent neurosurgeon in one of the leading research hospitals in the country, and he came in and realized he'd lost that dimensionality in his life, right? It was just, his reputation and clinical work, and he needed to get it back. So he said, I'm going to go play guitar, and he stumbled into a guitar store and he found a flyer on the wall that was for some rock band, and it said, what we don't have in quality, we make up for in volume, or something like that, I think it was. And he took the number and called. And he called me maybe 2 months after, and he said, Rob, I'm playing, rock guitar with 20-year-olds and I'm loving it.
That's fantastic.
It's just a completely different perspective in my life. I listen to their issues, I see my own differently, and it is a form of resilience, right? Yeah. It's not my best friend, it's not those 5, but it's a form of resilience that's happening, in those interactions there. And so that's what when I hear you saying leading with the activity, that's what I would see. People that have kind of lost these groups that they're an authentic part of through COVID because of social distancing, the more that they can, for example, like what he did was take a passion from the past and use it to slingshot, forward into a group. The only difference I would say is put the activity in a group that you're an authentic part of. And you get the benefit, of the perspective building, the friendships, other things like that.
The energy. Again, as you're sharing all this, I'm getting excited because I'm like, I'd like to shift that in my own life. I'd like to do this. But where I want to come back to is, it sounds like that there are people who are in the top 10% who used to be out of that 10%. So it's achievable, and I'm sure there's people who were in it formerly who fell out of it. So if I'm listening to us talk right now and I'm reading the book, that, hey, this is a quote unquote winnable battle. This is a place where I can get to and stay, but it's going to take some practice and ebb and flow. And is that a fair statement?
Very much. Yeah. I mean, Karen, my co-author, so I credit her a ton for continually calling out to me the importance of just being able to name this stuff and see it, because I think what happens is, we're taught, and these were all highly successful people from the top organizations out there, and you were taught to just overcome, right? I mean, these are all small things. I'm just going to overcome it, and it's just one more, it's not a big deal, right up until it is a big deal,
right.
And things happen. And so I think becoming attuned to it, I've heard so many people I talk to now that are saying, I'm pushing back on things more, I'm not, overcommitting myself in different ways in terms of dealing with the negative side, and then they're leaning in other ways that are really positive. And I think that's something we've got to get better at. I think, the loneliness effect, things like that are hitting, it's because we've fallen out of the groups, we stay online longer, on our emails, whatever it may be. And even when we're in them, we're not authentic. Right. A lot of times, and we need to find ways back to that.
Well, you and I we spoke about Susan David a while back, and her work around emotional agility and emotional literacy and toxic positivity, and it sounds like that's what you're touching on, a bit. Is that, yes, we've been schooled and oftentimes reinforced professionally and personally to be resilient, to just muscle through it, willpower through it. Yet if we can name it, if we can be present with it, if we can seek help, if we can find groups that can alleviate some of the stress, then we can be in a better place. Is that?
I think so. And to me, I go back to what I was saying earlier. We will chase cholesterol medication, we will chase blood pressure medication, and yet we will ignore something that has a higher mortality rate than, you know, excess alcohol, obesity, other things. And I think, I don't know where that's happened. You know what I mean? It's a measurement thing, obviously. You know what I mean? We can test for cholesterol and we know, you know, that there's links there. But I think we have to get back to that idea that these things are things we need to do to take care of ourselves. There's not going to be anybody in organizations that I'm aware of right now. There's no chief collaborative overload officer. There's nobody really thinking about this for people. They need to own it. And if they do, the upside's tremendous. You know, the 10%ers that I would talk to, they're living tremendous lives, and not at the sacrifice of performance, but they're more intentional, you know, about kind of what they're going to absorb, and then they're much more intentional and preserving their engagement, you know, with groups that create their identity versus letting it all fall, you know, to the profession.
Got it. Well, I've just got a couple more questions, and you actually touched on beyond collaboration overload, which I want to get to in a minute. But first, is there a multi-generational aspect to what you found in the book? Or like, are young people in their 20s or early 30s, you know, more practiced at setting boundaries and mitigating microstressors, or is this quite the opposite?
I think it's mixed.
Is it mixed?
You know, what the broad evidence shows is that the young generation is the most connected and simultaneously the most lonely. And so there is this question of, when I talk about authenticity and intimacy, like, most people think about a close relationship. It doesn't have to be your best friend. It doesn't have to be the inner five. It can be, we tend to move in tiers, you know, by virtue of Robin Dunlop's work. We go a close 5, then we have 12 to 15, then, you know, it goes out like that. And in your 12 to 15 tier, you can get a lot of great things from, and even from the 50 to 150 tier you can. But what you do need is some level of frequency in the relationship and some level of intimacy. So I think the younger generation, they're more willing to say, no, I won't do that. I don't like seeing what my parents did. But they seem to be less effective at the intimacy and the authenticity piece, you know, at least the broader work is showing. And so it's interesting. Now, on the other end of the scale, I will say the worst stories I heard, the ones that really amazed me, were, you know, these very successful leaders, man or woman, made it to the pinnacle of their careers because that's what all the narratives were, right? You're going to lean in, you're going to do whatever, right? From all this narrative. And they tell stories, though, that they made, you know, commercial success, but they left a wake of disaster. You know, they'd be talking about multiple divorces, children that didn't talk to them, you know, irreparable health issues that they were experiencing at that point in their life. And what always amazed me is those interviews almost always ended up with some variant of, it's been hard, but I'd do it again. And I would listen to that and I would go, really? You know?
That's all they know, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly it, I think, right? They never took that pivot in the guitar store to see what playing guitar with 20-year-olds could be like and what that could open up, or they never joined a book club or sang in a choir, you know, or whatever. They just never kind of took those opportunities. And what I think happens a lot is we go through these transitional points in life, whether it's a new job, a different role we're taking on. And what I heard a lot of is that there's a group of people, and it's the majority, that just comes in and says, I have to hunker down, right? So the next 18 months are going to stink, but then I'll get back into life. And they never do, right? And in contrast, my 10%ers would say, this is an opportunity to be a bigger version of myself, right? And they were kind of leaning into those transitional states, I think, a little bit better. And so that's, I think, something really important to be thinking about. Like, not are you becoming more narrow, but are you, you know, expanding out in different ways.
It's beautiful, and I'm going to take many of these clips and give it to my kids. I just like...
They'll love you for that.
Really, well,
because I'm sure mine will scour this.
I would rather them, you know, explore that internally, and if I might be so bold, learn the lesson now, as opposed to having to unlearn it, you know, 10, 15, 20 years down.
If you can.
Yeah, if you can, you know, and then sacrificing health and relationships, all the things that you mentioned. Right. So again, a couple more questions. So you came out with Beyond Collaboration over, what, 4 years ago? 5 years
only
ago?
2.
Only
actually.
2?
Yeah.
Wow, it's the COVID time. Yeah. So, because I knew you had your hustle on to get this over the finish line. But my question is, how does your work there relate to what's here? Is it totally distinct, or is there a relationship?
The primary difference is beyond collaboration overload. The publishers are always looking for a hook, right, in the titling, and so collaboration overload became the hook there. But at the heart of it, that was a study of high performers. What are high performers doing today? And we found that the biggest thing they were doing wasn't building massive networks. The biggest distinguisher was the efficiency of their network, and that allowed them to engage very differently, that generated innovation and scale and things like that. And so, because the first part of the book was how do you get the efficiencies, and the second part was around then how do you invest, it just kind of got titled that way. But at the heart of it, it was about high performers. This to me is about people that are thriving. And it's a different kind of outcome, and it was stimulated by the consortia, pushing me in different ways. And I say pushing, but they were opening their organizations. I mean, where else do you get 600, highly successful men and women to agree to interview with you for 90 minutes? So I'm very blessed that that vehicle is available to me. But that was the focus here, right? And again, we found that kind of removal of the negative, that's the first part of the book, was, I believe, more important in some ways than investing in the positive, which is the second half of it. But that's the line between the two.
Well, that invites the question, and again, we'll wrap up here in a couple minutes, but I've long explored the relationship between thriving / being in high well-being and performance. And many have seen that being binary, that there's a trade-off, or it's on a continuum, that you're sacrificing one for the other. Do you see places where someone can and is high performing and also thriving?
Oh, totally. So I would say a lot of the 10 percenters that were in what I call, so the reason I keep saying 10 percenters is what would happen in these interviews is they were all conventionally highly successful people. So the first 10 minutes were rainbows and lollipops. I've got a great job, it's going great, and on and on. And you get down to minute 30 and the cracks start to come in, and minute 45, minute 60, they're realizing they're faltering in different ways and they're holding it together. And by 90, you're like, oh my gosh. And these are people that were stars, you know what I mean, and what they did. But they weren't, they were portraying this visual, right, of success, and yet really barely holding it together, both personally and professionally. And most people would say, I feel like I'm not exceeding anywhere, but I'm focused on which balls can I drop, in my life today, overall. And yet 10% never followed that pattern. They just kind of never spiraled down. And to me, the heart of it, number one, they lived more intentionally. Number two, they didn't even call it work-life integration. It was just life, you know what I mean? And they were thinking about, given the work I want to be doing, how do I find my way into